Good morning. This is Pastor Rick and, of course, Pastor Steve. This is the Sunday Forum, June 14th, and we're just so pleased that you've joined us. We're going to lift up an important topic this morning, conversations about racial justice. You know, if not now, when? This seems to be the moment when we're all discussing this topic, not just in our homes, but in our families. And now we want to see if we can create a conversation about this important topic here at Emmanuel. Before we begin, we want to review our 7 principles of civil discourse and discernment. See, this has been an important part of our conversations, not just in the Sunday Forum, but I think more broadly in the congregation. And so when we have this conversation, especially tough conversations, as this one is, we want to remember the principles of respect, of listening deeply, and we're going to come back to that theme often, speaking only for ourselves and not for larger groups. Oh boy, understanding other viewpoints. We're going to all have to get a doctorate in how to learn to view the world from other viewpoints instead of just our own. Gratitude for what we see, the leadership of people stepping up and working for racial justice. Forgiveness, big topic for Christians in particular, that we forgive one another. And the 8th commandment, which means how do you put the best construction on the views that we're hearing instead of the worst construction, which is often our temptation. Steve, before we begin, let me just set some of the context for the conversation. And as you know, it's not just a conversation about racial justice, but it's happening as we're all social distancing, as COVID-19 has just wreaked havoc in our communities. And many of us are vulnerable. That's why we're at home. There's financial pressures. Businesses have closed. Some will not reopen, although we do see now some businesses opening up, some churches also opening up to in-person worship again. But of course, we've watched the police brutality in Minneapolis, and that sparked off all the protests in the streets. Especially our prayers go out to George Floyd, his family, but also for our people in Minneapolis as they really are struggling in their city with these pressures. But I should mention some other names because the incident with George Floyd did not happen in a vacuum. You have other stories of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Christian Cooper, the bird watcher in Central Park, Eric Gardner, who also used that line, I can't breathe. We remember Ferguson from way back, and also the Emmanuel 9. Now, this situation was the 9 people gunned down in a Bible study in Charleston, and Mother Emmanuel in Charleston. We have a special relationship in the ELCA with that incident because the boy who did the shooting was a member of an ELCA church, and 2 of the pastors who were killed were trained in our seminaries. And so you'll be hearing more about that on June 17th when we commemorate that incident. So, oh my goodness, Steve, a lot of context surrounding what we're watching now on TV, what we're watching in the streets each and every day. And yet I sense some hopefulness, and I want to hear your opinion on this too. Something seems different. And everybody keeps saying something seems different this time. And so to start off our forum, as you've been watching these incidents, on TV and the news, as you've watched this whole situation unfolding, what's been your reaction? I mean, how would you describe the moment that we're in right now?
Well, first of all, I appreciate the conversation time with Pastor Rick. I think we're a good team because as we at least begin to speak about these points, we want to draw everybody into it. One of the words that has come to mind for me in recent days is ambiguous. And interestingly enough, I found this book that I've been reading called Ambiguous Loss. It was written in 1999 by a woman named Barbara Ross. A few notes here. It's called Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief. And what she talks about on many avenues, even the example of a family living with someone with Alzheimer's, how everybody, their life changes. The older son, the younger daughter, the wife, and And everything around that circumstance carries so much ambiguity that the stress and knowing how to move forward is very difficult. So part of what I even see in that title, ambiguous loss, is think, for instance, about Dr. Martin Luther King. 1968. You and I remember this when he was killed in Memphis. And I remember some people saying after that they felt in the Black community that they'd really lost the voice in the leadership.
Right.
And I think in that void there has continued to be some ambiguity among not only perhaps the Black community, but the nation as well. So alongside that, and it was Dr. King that also made this statement, the most segregated hour of the week is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. So as churches, we've kind of played into some of that ambiguity. The other thing I think, as I was making some notes on this, was that here we are 50 years later, and the role of the church. Rick, you remember when we were critiqued as we're in a post-Christian era? It's as though the church was losing its voice. Part of it had to do with the fact that attendance was diminishing in our congregations. We can even see that now. So the conversation with the church was not as prevalent, and we'd also have to come back to the fact that maybe the church didn't know how to say it. We found ourselves behind the curve a lot in terms of some of these issues. I think the only other thing I'd add to it right now is that I've really noticed that what's happening here in the United States, I mean, it's a global situation.
It's a global.
We always use the phrase global community, but people around the world are watching, and we're watching around the world in terms of this being an issue, not just for the United States.
Yeah, it's a conversation that's happening everywhere. And like you said, because of the ambiguity, sometimes we want to be a healing force, but sometimes we're the problem. We need to hear the prophetic word ourselves. And so, many of us, and I'll say sometimes I'm afraid to talk about racial justice because I'm afraid to say the wrong thing. I'm afraid that I will not be articulate and I'll offend one group or another group. And so, fear often keeps me isolated. And so I think, you remember the disciples after the resurrection, they also were afraid and gathered in an upper room in fear. And the first thing the resurrected Jesus always says is fear not. And so I think the spirit of this conversation, Steve, is fear not. We're going to have this conversation and pray that God would bless
Well,
it.
and the reality here, we've got two aging white males here leading some of the conversation. And I think it's just imperative how we are aware that the learning curve is really big for all of us.
Yeah, we wanted Teresa to really assist us in the conversation and help to lead it. She just couldn't be with us on this Sunday, but she's going to play an important role in guiding us, especially connecting us with important groups in the neighborhood.
In our community, yes.
Right. So let me ask a second question then, and that's, again, to help frame not just one conversation we're hoping to have, but multiple conversations through Christmas. And so this is not just a one-off Sunday forum. We're going to have many. But what is your hope for this congregation? What is your hope for Emmanuel as we reflect and discuss these issues of racial justice beginning together, beginning this Sunday forum?
Right. Well, I've been here since 1999, so that's a number of years now. And that means that in this congregation, I've had a chance to be here when some other issues came up on a national scene. You've heard of the ostrich syndrome, right? Where people just put their heads in the sand and ignore everything. In 2009, the issues around human sexuality in the church were kind of like that. A lot of congregations didn't really want to talk about it. They were happy to pass out the pamphlets for people to read, but in terms of the conversation within the community itself, there was a void. So I will tell you that in I got to go to the right year here. In 2009, around 2009, we had quite a forum of over about 6 weeks where we talked about the issues of human sexuality. One of the funny things of that I recall was one couple afterwards said something to this effect. He looked at his wife and he says, "Honey, we didn't know anything about homosexuality before this." And she looked at him and said, "Honey, we didn't know anything about heterosexuality." So there was a lot going on there in terms of just the nature of that topic. So that in its own right. The other thing.
Let me ask you about
Yeah,
that, Steve, because that was a tough conversation.
Sure it was.
Looking back, what did you learn about the congregation in walking through tough conversations like that, where there was disagreement?
Well, and there was to use the word ignorance, I think was just be real kind with that word, because a lot of people had simply not experienced people from different lifestyles. So what we did was we brought people in from the gay and lesbian community, as an example, to have some of the conversations and listen to their stories. And that was the key to the whole event. Was over a period of 6 weeks, we learned to listen to one another, and therefore we found ourselves in a different arena, I think, at the end of that. Still
hearing that word, listening.
Yeah, that's right.
It's tough too when you. It's hard to listen, especially when people are sharing things that are either uncomfortable or unfamiliar or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've tried to start in our family is listening to my family members, my kids, and to my father. And he has a different way of talking about racial justice. And I just want to point this out to all of us. And because when he remembers back the civil rights movement, he was a pastor, and we were in actually Norfolk, Virginia, and our church was just a few blocks from where Teresa actually went to college, went to the university. He was used to conscious bias, and he's very upfront about it, that his father, he would say that my grandfather was a racist.
Yeah.
He would speak the N-word quite pronounced, and he had real issues with blacks participating in Rockford, Illinois, in going to certain restaurants, to certain restaurants, water fountains, the whole bit. And he was open, and it was conscious. It was right up front.
Right.
So he celebrates the civil rights movement and the progress that was made. He has more difficulty, I think it's fair to say, with unconscious bias, where there are ways that we've been shaped and formed just in our upbringing that can lead to some real negative behaviors or policy. And then when he sees the protests, he understands them when it's focused on the violence in Minnesota of that policeman, but not the unconscious violence that's led to other systemic issues.
Right.
So I have to ask you here, Steve, when did you become, because we want to learn to tell our own stories here, so we are listening to each other, right?
Right.
When did you first become aware of racial bias in your own life, and whether that's conscious or unconscious?
Yeah.
How young were you?
Well, Rick, I have a camera with me here. Now, this is a camera I haven't used for about 20 years. And this is maybe a little bit of a segue, not as I expected, but I think the point is this. This camera has only one lens to it. And for many years, all the pictures that I took were taken with one lens. I wanted to buy one of those, those fancy lenses, didn't have the money, so it was always just a kind of a small snapshot. It was a very different thing when I discovered panoramic lenses, or, you do that in your iPhone now. So part of this is that the lens that I experienced growing up was kind of one small lens. It was not panoramic. And that's not to critique anything other than the reality of living in a town of 700 people in Northwest Iowa.
Right.
And in that context, some of the things that I became aware of, it took really a long time, some subtle things. I remember, I think I told you, I was out on the dock of the lake one day fishing, and my uncle came out, and he made a comment about there were some colored people going by in a boat out on the lake. Now, I was probably 6 or 7 at the time, and what I saw was people, one person had a red jacket on, the other had a blue jacket, a yellow windbreaker. I did not know that he was referring to the skin color at that time. And I discovered that even with the kids, that sometimes they don't seem as aware of that until later on it's drawn to their attention. So that was part of it. I think another thing, to even expand the conversation, I realized when I was going out on field trips in school, we went up, for instance, to Spirit Lake to talk about the Spirit Lake Massacre, which happened in the 1800s. And of course, you can see how the language was used. Even as a young boy, I remember references to the Native Americans as the savages, right, in that conversation. And I came to find out also this past week that whole event initially spun around the lake that I grew up on in Northwest Iowa. So I think what I'm trying to say in part is here we talk about issues between different people, and also the Native Americans and others have similar struggles in terms of how they've been framed out by our lenses.
See, I grew up like you in a rural environment,
Yep.
rural Maryland. I can't remember ever seeing even a black person until I was 12. I was asked to work on a farm.
Mm-hmm.
And on that farm, they bring in workers. And I was 12, but I was big. And they thought it was time to work full time on the farm. And so there were about 16 of us. And John Revere was there. And he was a black man, probably in his 50s at the time. And when we would all come in and eat all these feasts for lunch, I mean, steaks, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pies, he wouldn't eat with us. He would eat separate in the kitchen. And so, you're 12 years old, you're trying to figure this out. So I asked the boss, who happened to be Mrs. Street, happened to be my Sunday school teacher too. Mm-hmm. I said, why does he not join us? And so here's what happened. She said, I've invited him to join the group multiple times. I'm not going to force him against his will, but I've invited him because I want him to join the group, but he's refused. Mm-hmm. So then, of course, I got to talk with him in the kitchen.
Sure.
And he said, well, I just prefer to eat here in the kitchen by myself because I'm closer to the food. Mm-hmm. Now, as you can imagine, I've reflected back on that. There was a lot going on there, both conscious and unconscious, where he wasn't going to shake things up because his job probably would have been in jeopardy if anything negative would have happened in him moving into the big table. Yeah. So one of the things that struck me then is how early, even talking to my own kids, how early we notice things, and we don't often have the language or we can't articulate the concepts, but we know something's off, something's not right, and that shapes us in pretty significant ways.
Can I add, a few, I mentioned this event as a young boy going up and looking at Native American history. And the unfortunate thing is years later, when I came back into that area, I was still hearing some of the narrative that was using language that you would not expect us to be using now in terms of describing a certain group of people with one, in this case, very negative framework.
It was much more upfront, wasn't it? I mean, it was not as subtle. I'm not saying it's any better or worse. It's just that it was pretty much in your face. The language.
It was. And I think the only other thing to add to that would be the experience that I had compared with my sons later. I mean, when one of my boys moved here in 1999, he ended up going to Lele High School. And in Lele High School, I want to say there were 60, 70 different nations represented in that school. And that alongside my very homogenous childhood.
For many people, I think, we're going to ask you this later on to write down your own stories, those that were impactful for you. But for some of us, high school, junior high school, being a part of bands or choirs or sports teams was maybe one of the first times we had a chance really to get to know someone so much different than ourselves. And I always wonder whether, these sports teams, again, choirs, bands, maybe is that helpful bridge where we get to know each other and learn a little bit more about difference. But I want to explore some other stories maybe in your life, Steve, that really formed and shaped you, not just early on, but these were events maybe in your life, whether recently or way back when, maybe as a small child, that most impacted you, informed you in regard to racial justice. Do you remember any stories that?
Pastor Frank Lee is from Story City, Iowa. And when I was in high school, I went to a Bible camp for the first time there, and I got elected to a position in the church, and I didn't even know what it was at the time, but it was a district president of the American Lutheran Church at the time. What I realized was I was going to be thrown into a very different arena. And so I have to say that some of the shaping that occurred with me after those elementary years was entering into the church at a very unique time, because during those years, I want to say from 1967 to 1971, when I became a leader in the state Iowa church, I also traveled to Chicago to some multiracial conferences. I spent time on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation for a week as we went into preparing to go to the national gathering at Madison Square Garden. When we got to the national gathering, we were talking about scenes like famine and Biafra and all of these. And I also recall that there was a wonderful, one of the takes that I had at the national gathering, goodness, 1970, was a man at the gathering named Eddie Bonamere. He was a Black musician, and he taught us all a song. And do you know that song has always been with me? This is what it sounds like. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. He doesn't care about the color of your skin or what religion you've been in. Help me, Jesus, to love my neighbor as myself. And you know, the people I've talked to from that convention, if I can still find them, remember that as a key imprint of helping to love one another with, I'd say, some new lenses, new experiences. I've got something else too I need to tell you about, but I'll wait till you call me into it.
Our family has had multiple stories, and so it's hard. I think what you're saying too, it's hard to come down to one or two because there's so many stories that impact us along the way. Obviously, as I said, high school was very formative. These sports teams, working in Africa, even working in Germany, learning about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, that he was shaped significantly. Someone we all admire and quote all the time was he was shaped in Harlem by the Abyssinian Baptist Church. So I read all those things, but then we moved back to Chicago, and Chicago was filled with stories where we ran into voices and movements and dynamics that were so much different than Africa, by the way. Just so much different. And I'll just share one story. I was a pastor of a little church on the South Side. So that's a predominantly Black area of Chicago. And we had a multiracial church. And our tradition, like we practice here at Emmanuel, is to hold hands when we would sing the Lord's Prayer. So the Lord's Prayer came, we started singing. And after the service, one of our Black members came and said there was a 15-year-old boy who would refuse to hold his hand. And he was really upset by that and asked me to do something about it. So what do you do? How do you teach? How do you catechize? So we went into that family, but that Black member, very wise, we did it together. And he told his stories. And that young 15-year-old had never heard stories like that before. And it took 3 or 4 weeks, and it didn't happen in one conversation. But they, afterward, they'd always stand next to each other. Now, this took a while. They stand next to each other as a sign of their unity in Christ. So I guess it said, to me, it's not always hopeless, because sometimes we watch the protests and we say, oh, will we ever make progress? And yes, we celebrate some of the progress since the civil rights movement, but other times it seems like, oh, how do we move beyond where we stand now? That was an example to me that if we can get everybody in the room, sometimes God can bless it and move us forward.
Well, I just have to say this, because when I was talking about the high school experience, let me tell you quickly about when I became a pastor in the church and I was out in the Rocky Mountain Synod. In 1994, I was invited to be part of what were called anti-racism teams, And part of the strategy was to spend several days with people from multiple backgrounds and, again, share the stories, right? But then when we went out into the communities, other churches, I teamed up with an African-American woman named Karen. And then we only could speak from our own context. And I just need to tell you, one of the stories that really surprised me as I spent time getting to know Karen, she was in a marriage. She'd married an Anglo man. And she said she remembers traveling with her kids. And when they go to hotels, her husband would sometimes say, honey, would you go in and get a room? Well, she goes in and she comes out and she says, I can't get a room. They don't have anything. Her husband then said, and again, he was an Anglo man, he let me go in and check. And of course, he'd come out not only with a key to a room, but to a nice suite, right? So those stories, for us to bring them into the context of the church and the experiences that are so different is why it's important for us to, as you say, invite these stories for us to share. We've even had some interesting already, some that have been given to us.
So, yeah, we want to, of course, many of us are asking, we feel trapped at home. We watch the protests on the television, but some of us have health concerns, but we still want to know, what can we do? I mean, is there anything we can do? And many of us have multiple stories we can tell about those events in our own lives that have shaped us for good or ill, right? For good or ill. And so one of our what to do next is we want to encourage you to have conversations about racial justice in your own families. Now, you probably don't need our help into having those conversations. You know how in your family you like to discuss things the best. But this would be multi-generational. I think we need to have our grandkids, our kids, our parents, maybe the grandparents. We want to listen to each other because almost everybody's got a story to tell here, and usually multiple stories. And so, but if you're looking for help, ask these two questions just to get things going, because my wife and I, we've discussed racial issues, racial justice issues for years and years and years, but I never asked her, first of all, what were her first memories of racial difference or racial bias. And she told me stories I had not heard before. So it might be good to ask your spouse or your loved one or even your grandkids, what was their first sense of difference and often of bias? And the second question is, okay, now what are the one or two events, one or two, that have most impacted your own approach to racial justice? Now, we received a letter this week, both of us, quite detailed.
Yes, very much.
About their impressions of both the progress that has been made since they were young and growing up, but also the frustrations now of seeing violence on the streets and confusion, ambiguity, all those things, anger. We want to invite, first of all, you to have that conversation in your families. Secondly, if you feel comfortable, if you would write us and share those stories, you can send them to me or to Pastor Steve. We would like to share them in future conversations here on the Sunday Forum. Now, if you want to share your story, but not your name, that's fine. I understand that. But we want to start a conversation this way. We can't meet here in the media center. So we thought we'd share these stories like we did with our experiences of Holy Communion, so that we can create, you might say, a library of experiences so that we can understand. What's the goal? It's to listen. First of all, we're going to listen to our families, and then we want to listen to members of the congregation. If you have other ideas on how we might best do that, please share them with me. And then go ahead.
The other thing that's really important there is, again, the I statements, to write from your own perspective. We all know about the Thanksgiving tables, and Christmas tables when we try to have these family discussions. And I found myself recently getting a little worked up sometimes when I'm in a disagreement with someone. And then I have to step back and I say, now, just wait a minute. They're telling their story. You can't tell somebody else's story. So if we frame that out, it's really quite an interesting exercise to simply say, okay, I'm going to talk from my perspective with the willingness to listen to someone that brings the other perspective.
It's so important and so hard. Let's just acknowledge this. With my dad, obviously I want to convert him to my opinion about racial justice. I think he wants to convert me too. He wants to tell his stories about where he came from, and I don't think he feels that I respect his positions or his experiences. Yeah. And so I've just noticed how anxious I get just sitting there listening. I want to always interject. I think we have to learn to listen first. Listen first. And it's hardest with our relatives, right?
And with you and I, sometimes on pastors, you get projections of the halo effect, which means that, we've got it down. We know how to listen. We know how to have a compassion. But we go through the same things. I mean, we find things building up in us that what they sometimes say is we have to get out where we can share it in other arenas, because it might surprise some of you what goes through our own hearts in terms of the struggles.
And the forgiveness part, we
Yeah,
want a little
yeah.
discernment, because often when we're listening to family members or friends, they use the wrong language. And I'll just say sometimes I use the wrong language.
We all do.
And you get caught in a minefield where you're saying things that you didn't want to say, or you're using phrases that actually seem to suggest things. So we want to practice as much gratitude that they're willing to talk, and then forgiveness, so that we're first listening, and then we can move to other aspects of the conversation. I know too, it's a shame that Teresa can't join us this Sunday, but she will in the future, because she wants to help us listen to the neighborhood, Stephen. She's already invited us into several conversations, you in particular, into several conversations with Black leaders, religious leaders in particular, here in the neighborhood. Can you say anything about that?
Well, I alluded to that a little bit last Sunday in making an announcement that I'd have to realize that probably the zone that I was trained in as a pastor was not in the community as much as in the parish. I don't know how else to say it. So I indicated that, for instance, I was very, very comfortable going into hospitals and going into rooms where people were dying or family situations. But to be beyond that into the community was another step. Now, you and I have both admitted we've been stretched a little bit, but right now I appreciate Teresa so much, because she is helping us even more so get out into the community with a new perspective on what we might be as a church, involving ourselves in the community.
So we hope that in the future, we'll not only hear from your letters and your experiences, but we'll also have some of the community members join us here in the Sunday Forum. So again, we can practice. First step, to do is probably not to do, but it's to listen. And that's just so important.
That's right.
So again, you've got homework. I hope that you'll accept this challenge. We're all going to try to do that here. We were trying to practice it today. Is first of all, to listen to your family. Just to have your family talk, and maybe start with those two questions, right? When did you first recognize racial bias or racial difference in your life? And don't be surprised if those stories go back to early years. As kids, we pick up on all sorts of different things. Listen, parents and grandparents, to your children, your grandchildren. They have stories to tell, and they'll want you to listen to them. We can honor our kids in no greater way than to listen to them, especially because this is so important to our kids and grandkids.
What I hope for too, Rick, is that this is a chapter of many chapters of conversation that we're going to have. This is not going to work with just one conversation and we say we've covered that. No, I think that we're writing a new book here, and that means we've got many chapters to write together in this conversation.
The second question is, what are the one or two events in your own life that have been so impactful to you in shaping your own sense of racial justice? It'd be helpful just to think that through. I think as we've done this exercise together, we've got a lot of stories to tell. We don't have time for all our stories, but I hope you'd have time to listen again to those in your families as they, first of all, listen to their stories. Third is, please, if you feel comfortable, send those stories to us so that we can share them with the wider church, either if you so desire to sign those or not. The key is that we get to tell those stories more broadly so that we understand each other. It's got to be a conversation. And you remember gratitude? We're grateful for anyone who's willing to jump into that conversation, because there's so many minefields here, so many mistakes that we can make, and we want to be gracious to each other. And finally, Steve, and Teresa are going to guide us into a larger conversation. We can't do that globally. We can't probably do that nationally, but we can do one here from Naples and hear some of our leaders and listen and try to understand each other better. So thank you for joining us this morning for the Sunday Forum, for one of a series of conversations that we will be having here at Emmanuel on social justice. And the question's right? If not now, when? And our prayer is that God would bless us in this conversation, would bless our congregation. But particularly this morning, know that we're praying for you as you have those conversations in your families at home. So pray for us. We're praying for you.
Thanks, everybody. And Rick, thank you for helping to set the stage for this in our congregation with all of the faces of Emmanuel.
Bye-bye now.